Alright, so this is the last video that I'm going to make about this, at least for now. And that is exploring theoretical frameworks that I'm understanding using Tinderbox. So I have two frameworks right now that I'm developing. One is called the stress recovery theory, and the other that's called the attention restoration theory. And I want to show both of them and how I'm using notes and Zettelkasten and Tinderbox all together. So we'll pop into attention restoration theory. So this theory has a definition and parts and pieces, and I could just have traditionally written a reading note about an article I read and write all of that in some sort of kind of note-based essay form, and that's how I used to do things. But now what I'm doing is I'm trying to conceptualize the theory visually with notes and then put the meat of the notes in these sort of zettels that I've mentioned in other videos. So here you'll see, I'll take away the note view for a second. You'll see the whole thing that I've mapped out here, which is I'm using kind of concept mapping where I've got a note that is a title of a concept, and if I want to understand, I can tell this is a zettel because it has a little an icon here. If I want to see what demanding environment means, then I can read my zettel about demanding environment. And then I have annotated the arrow. So demanding environment leads to stress, which fatigues attention, and choosing a restored environment triggers a restorative process, which leads to attention restoration. That's the theory. And then restorative environment has these parts that are very important to the theory: being away, fascination, extent, and compatibility. And a note here about fascination in that it can be hard and it can be soft, and it should be soft in order to be restorative. Hard fascination being something like a compelling movie or a train wreck or something where you're just like totally captivated by something, but your attention is actually depleted while you're being captivated by it. So I have, just like with demanding environment, I have created zettels for a lot of these concepts within the larger model. So if I want to understand fascination, then I can read my zettel about it, and years later, hopefully that zettel will be much more nuanced. And if I want to remember like the restorative process and what it particularly is, then I have the note here that at first it's clearing the head, then it is renewing the attention, and then it is going into this place of reflection. And I'm able to recall that specific part. And what's cool is that there's another article that I've discovered that's specifically just about the restorative process and unpacking those pieces. And I can read that article, add it as a citation to this particular zettel, and flesh out the zettel much more robustly based on what I learned from that article. But it stays part of this model, and it's accessible through this model no matter how many articles I read. It'll just change right here. This little 1 will be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 in the future, because I've read all these articles that help me flesh out that one specific concept, which is what's happening when one is restored in an environment according to this specific model. So, and just for grins, I also have this little brainstorming box here. I double click in it, and I have all this thoughts about attention that are kind of cooking in this particular model, which I think is kind of a neat way that you can use Tinderbox. So I've popped back up to the theories pane, and I want to go over to the other model to show you how I'm using that one, which is similar, but it's different too. So this is the stress recovery theory. And this one's more vertically oriented. And it's also, I wouldn't say it's, maybe it's more complex. I'm not exactly sure yet. Probably equally complex, but my understanding of this model needed more notes than the understanding of Kaplan's model, because it involves some psychology stuff that I didn't need to really anchor in with the Kaplans, or they didn't call out like the author of this framework did. So you have these prior experiences that lead to an initial affective state, and if you recall when we were first looking at the zettels, this was one of the ones that we looked at. So we can click on it and we can see Actually, this isn't the one we looked at specifically. That one I think was called initial affective reaction. But the initial, that right here actually, that's where this one is. This is the one that we looked at in the other one. Initial affective state is a zettel though, and it shows me what exactly does initial affective state mean. So you move from the initial affective state into an environment, and that environment has qualities that are perceived visually. This theory is highly reliant on visual perception. These qualities are all these things right here. And if I want to understand, for example, what depth means to this specific theoretical framework, then I've got that answer in my zettel right there. And you'll see here that water that we clicked on before is associated in this case with the natural features of an environment that are restorative according to this theory. And I imagine that as I continue to study this stuff, water, because we know water is very restorative in many ways, will probably develop into its own play space. Well, when that happens, what's likely to happen is I'll just double click water, oops, and go into a whole new world where I can map out all the different things around, as I'm learning, it's called blue space. And my whole water exploration can be underneath this one note about water in this one theory, which I think is pretty neat. So, back to the model. We've got this initial state in an environment that has these qualities. We perceive them. Then what happens? Well, according to this theory, that can trigger this initial affective reaction, which we talked about already, and that might just lead straight down into a motivation or impulse and an actual choice or behavior. So, for example, if you go into a space and you perceive it as threatening, you might leave. That would be purely affective. You wouldn't be thinking much. There would be no cognition there. You would just flight, that model, fight or flight. But also what can happen in this model is that once you have that initial like or dislike, you can marry that with the previous experiences that you've had. That could trigger a loop of thinking. It could trigger a loop of feeling. It could trigger both. And then that might take you into a motivation or impulse that has got your brain, your frontal lobe thinking, not just your emotions, into some sort of adaptive behavior or functioning. So this is the model there, and just like with my other model, I have all sorts of zettels that have been created, which were basically triggered by the notes I took in my notebook while I was reading on my iPad. So that's how I'm using Tinderbox right now, and why I think it's probably going to work for me is because I know that part of this is reading things that I care about because they're about the questions that I have, but I'm really enjoying this process of going in and figuring out where to plot and how to record these things that I'm learning. It's like an enjoyable thing instead of a tedious task. It actually becomes it's something I look forward to doing after I've read something, and it doesn't feel like it's sitting in a folder on my computer in Google Docs somewhere. It feels like it's still active and alive and relevant because I'm seeing it in the context of something larger every time I'm going around and adding to things. It'll be interesting as I add to this. Well, I feel like my restorative environments adornment feels a little distant and lost once I get really deep into technology or contemplative stuff. Like, maybe, I'm not so sure. And I guess the very last thing I wanted to take you to is just a little bit of an orientation. Here's where one of those bugs are. An orientation to how I am recording different parts of this besides just theories. And that is just when I come across, for example, a method that someone uses, I put it in the methods thing so that I don't forget that this is one way that you can study restorative environments. And sometimes I will come across instruments most of the time that I've never heard of, and I want to keep track of them. And so these are just the various instruments that people are using to either exhaust one's attention or measure someone's preference of an environment. And I want to kind of know those and maybe link them to ideas that I have in the future. Similarly with findings, my strategy with my findings desktop is to basically pretend like I heard about the study on Radiolab and summarize it as if I would tell a friend on the bus or something. You know, oh, did you hear about this study that blah? And just have these kind of nuggets of examples of studies. And then arguments are, this is just a real kind of fuzzy place for me right now, but basically trying to map out how do people make the arguments about what restorative environments help solve. And so I'm just playing around with that right now, which is why it looks a little less pretty, but is exactly why I love this software, because it's not only this place for me to type out some sort of note. All the capability I need to do that is here, and I can use Markdown, and I can use WikiLinks, and I can use the stuff that I would use in the archive or Bear or rotational velocity, but it also allows me to manipulate those notes, to copy them or create aliases and add things to them and connect them to each other in infinite ways. I can have water and various different theories and various different ideas and still just play with it. It feels playful. And I don't have to constrain myself to being super linear. I can really just kind of dive in to some area like I did before with this sort of exploration of attention, which will be very important, I think, ultimately, because all of these things center around attention in some way. And maybe that will be really useful one day, and it's just this little rabbit hole of thought. And it literally feels like that, just this little pipe that I go down into this bigger space that I get to play around in. So that's all I want to share for now. Probably be coming back to you at some point in the future to share how this has evolved and what works about it and what doesn't. I think that the largest lesson for both of these methods, Zettelkasten and using Tinderbox, is that they are really kind of intimidating. Even just the way that some of the words sound, agents, adornments, zettels, sounds, I don't know, like you have to learn something just to begin learning. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to just play. Really, that advice is the best advice, is just start trying and make it work for you. And maybe the notes that you create at first will ultimately not be what you do, but you won't get to what you do without creating those notes. And you may not use, I'm certainly not using Tinderbox for all of its capacities, but I'm using it, and it's actually working quite well for me. And if I tried to use it to its capacities, it would be too overwhelming, honestly. And I'm developing new capacities for it that maybe nobody else uses in this way. And if I were to follow someone else's footsteps, I wouldn't discover that. So that's my advice. Hope you find this helpful.